Hello everybody and welcome to yet another Focus Chat. The topic for today's chat is Polyglot Programmer, Pros and Cons. I'm Alex Bolboaca and I'm coming to you from the Mozaic Works studios, and today my guest is, as you've been used for many times now, Adi. Welcome, Adi.
Hello.
So I thought about chatting about polyglot programming because of the following thing that happened recently. One of my nieces is actually now on the Polytechnics University, and she's learning automatics and computers, of let's say computer science and software development. And their teacher told them that they should learn Java because Java is, the best language because it will bring them jobs and, it will be really good for them. And they were asking, but, maybe should we also look at Python or no, learn Java, that's the way to go. And she asked me, okay, so what do you think? And I think we've had this conversation many times with many developers. But I thought that we would start by going from, let's say, beginner and pre-professional programmers, students in programming, what does polyglot programming help them or not? And then move through the career and see how this helps, or if it does help. Now, before we start, I have to say that we both are polyglot programmers, so there might be some bias here, but maybe we have some good reasons for that, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as my experience, I think I started off with Java. So first of all, it's very interesting that not Java was probably the first language I knew most, but it's very interesting that where I studied at the same Polytechnics University, we started being used to a bunch of programming languages. We had something like Lisp for functional programming and Haskell, and then we had MATLAB, and then we used Java, and we used C and C++, and that was only something like 3 or 4 years. And probably I missed a few of these languages. There were some very weird languages specific for, I don't know what, electronics, automation, and so on. So I think that's where we're starting from. I don't think that all the universities do that. Maybe they're more reserved from this point of view.
Yeah.
But then
this maps my experience as well, because so I started, I think first year was mostly C, C++. But then we've also done, because I finished before you, of course, and we've done MATLAB for various useful, I don't even remember what we were using it for, but we've used it.
Electrotechnics or
Yeah, I think so. Signal processing. Yeah,
signal processing, and there was something very interesting around what now you see in every parking lot, but that was very new at that moment, to have from a picture to identify what's the plate number of a car, and then start using it, which was kind of wow.
Yeah, and in MATLAB you could actually do fast Fourier transforms very easily and all kinds of operations like that. And you could see very quickly the outputs, which was really cool. And I remember doing one special language for parallel programming.
Yeah, exactly. Those were the weird languages. I don't remember the name.
I think we've done Camel.
Yeah, Camel. Yes.
And Yeah, and then Java and, well, a few others. My first professional language where I actually worked in was C++ with Windows, so that was uh, that was my experience. And then I switched to Java and C Sharp and learned Python and PHP and Haskell and many others. But yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So I started Java, then C Sharp, and because we were already working in a team where we were doing. So now there's this concept of backend programming and front end programming, which I find very non-familiar because I've always done both. So we were doing both C Sharp and JavaScript. At that moment, we didn't have any jQuery or anything of the sort. We were just write JavaScript, and jQuery appeared many years after. And then yeah, I started using whatever language I needed. So even if it was Python or some bit of Clojure or yeah, anything that we needed. So I think that's the kind of openness that I'm used to.
and the general advice that I got from, I think it was from pragmatic programmers, that it's good to learn one new programming language every year.
Mm-hmm.
Now, honestly, I haven't done that because there are many programming languages and I try some of them. I tried many of them at code retreats or at other community events with many programmers where I could sit down and pair and see how different languages work. But nonetheless, I was interested in learning, and at least I know how to write code in the big, I don't know, top 6 or 7 programming
Mm.
languages, right? Um,
I think the paradigm is important. So if we talk about uh, polyglot programming, that can be a bit too much to say. I think you need to understand one very well one programming language from one paradigm. For example, one, let's say object-oriented programming, something like maybe C++ or Java or C Sharp, uh, which is a static language. Then you need to understand something which is a dynamic language, like Ruby, and you need to understand some a language that's functional, like like Clojure or Lisp or something like that. And after that, I think everything mixes, and you can understand anything.
yeah, and that was my reply as well. That once you learn, it's like with foreign languages. Once you learn the four important languages, then all the others are easy. It's just a rehash of the same things. So when we talk about natural languages, we know there are some big families of language, and there's actually studies that if you learn like a Germanic language, a Latin language, um, if you really want an Indic language, an Asian language like Chinese and so on, then even if you don't know all of them really well, but if you learn them really early in your development, then you can learn very quickly a new language. And we notice that when knowing French, right? When you go to Portugal or you go to Italy or you
Mm-hmm.
understand that it it's the same structure of the phrase, it's the same or similar words and so on. And after all, programming is much more restricted than that. You don't have a lot of constructs that you can use that are very different
Mm-hmm.
from a programming language to another.
Yeah, I think the only big difference or the thing that was in a way shocking was because I started with object-oriented programming, how the the uh, the ap- the approach in functional programming is. I think that's the only big shift that I felt, and also the shift. between looking at the compiler and looking at the interpreter, in between the static the static like C# or Java and the interpreted languages like Python, where I think those are in fact the things you need to look at.
Yeah, I think there's another one that I felt, which is a difference between type systems. There are type systems that are very permissive, like let's say Python, duck typing, if it quacks like a duck, it looks like a duck. The interpreter assumes it is a duck, it doesn't check anything. And then you have things like Java and C++, which check types, and you have to give a type very specific and so on. But then there are even stronger type systems. There's a language that I'm currently, I don't remember precisely, but fundamentally, when you write something in that language, it's guaranteed to be correct at runtime. I think it's a variant of Haskell or something built on top of Haskell, and that kind of construct is really weird to me, but it expands your mind, it expands your horizon, and it actually built on top of some of the things I knew from C++, because it's actually a lot of, let's say, meta programming or generic programming with strong types. But yeah, you're right. So, but in addition to this, I would add strong types. That's also variation. Now, these languages are not very used. It's mostly a
Things like
curiosity.
Haskell isn't that used. I think Clojure is very much used, at least where I saw that someone is very much performance, especially on data, where you have a lot of data coming. People tend to use something like Clojure because it's extremely fast. Probably it's the most performant language after Haskell, but Haskell is so difficult and so difficult to have specialists. While Clojure with Clojure you have more. But that's kind of a very narrow niche. But otherwise, I think everybody will use or can use or JavaScript, Python, and something like C sharp and Java, or language like this or Ruby, because they are very much used in the enterprise, in the real world, in the
Yeah.
projects.
Yeah, and just to clarify, when I talked about very strong type systems, Haskell and Clojure allow you to build very strong type systems that validate the behavior at compile time, but they don't enforce it. There are some languages that actually enforce it, so that's a slightly different approach. But these are the languages that are mostly curiosity. Okay, so we've looked a bit at the map of languages, and perhaps one more thing needs to be added, that today there's a lot of Java code on backend enterprise systems. Some of it is even on internal applications that are desktop applications or things like that. I think the modern applications are mostly built based on services plus multiple user interfaces. The services tend to be written in things like Java or C#, but they can also be written in Python or other things. And on the other hand, for user interface, you need JavaScript, obviously, often
With all the variants.
with its variants, and often with some React or some Angular or some other framework.
CSS, which maybe can be a language as well.
CSS, yeah, HTML, of course.
HTML. Yeah.
If you go, but you also have, for the same services, you have mobile. And for mobile, you have Java for Android, and you have Objective-C for iPhone, and I think
There's some other newer languages, like I used Flutter,
mhm,
which is something kind of newer, which is really interesting, and it's thought for mobile. So
yeah,
that
and
new things are appear. But when I started using it I did need to learn a bit about how you structure everything for the mobile page. But the language itself, it was very similar to Python or
yeah,
something like that.
and the thing is, for the tendency is for everything to go JavaScript
Mm-hmm.
nowadays. Node.js for servers, and then JavaScript on the client, JavaScript for mobile. Ideally, write once and then deploy on Android, on iOS, on Windows Phone, Windows applications, and as web applications. But most attempts until now, not so great. We still have some way to go there.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I mean, JavaScript is not a bad language, but it can lead to really ugly code. And I quite dislike the ecosystem. The ecosystem is so full of hundreds and thousands of very small libraries that you have no idea what they are doing. And I have no idea who's maintaining them and how they work together. And so it's a bit of a mess from my point of view.
Yeah, but I mean that's the ecosystem already. If we give advice to someone who wants to learn a language, I think they should learn the language anyway, because even if the ecosystem is not that great, you learn something from that language which you can apply in another language.
Mhm.
I think that's interesting. JavaScript is very interesting language which is very versatile, and you can it has a huge power which can bring huge problems, because you can write functional code, object-oriented code, dynamic code, static code to some extent. So you can write basically anything from all the family of languages.
Yeah. All right. So going back, I think if we are talking about students, um, the general advice is, from my point of view, is that it's good to learn multiple programming languages, but I think one very important thing is to get a deep dive and get a deep understanding of at least one programming language and all
Mm-hmm.
its ecosystem. So what I mean by this, it's not enough to know how to write Java code, right? You probably need to know Maven or Gradle. You need to know how to compose a project, what libraries are there, and how, at least the most used one, how to do logging, uh, how to create a small or web service, a small web application, um, things like that, right?
And the best thing is to have a pet project. I think start something, start something that you think would be useful. Maybe it's not, but start something that you think would be useful, and work on it for a few months, and you'll learn a lot more than what you'd learn in school in a more theoretical problem approach. So like what you were saying, start off with something like a web application for I don't know what. Think you're a bank, think you're an insurance company, a telecom company, and you want to have, I don't know, products and services, and start with something like that. I don't know. Think you want a home bank or a system, and write something like that just for learning.
Yeah,
See how you deploy it, see how you work on it, see how you start the system, how you everything.
one good start is to do a Twitter clone.
Yes, yes, that's a very good project. Yes.
Because Twitter is fairly simple. You have people, you have messages, you have direct messages. So there are a few features that you can add and see the timeline and perhaps search later and so on.
Mhm.
But do it in a way that, client server. So you have on the server, you have a few services, you expose an API, you call the API from the client, things like that. So
Yes.
that's an easy, well, not easy, but a good project to.
Yeah, it can be very simple because probably in the beginning you don't care about security and you don't care about stuff like that. It's on your machine and you can play with two users or something like that, or a few users, or you can put it somewhere on a server. But again, you shouldn't care about security that much, and you could start playing around with your friends and see how it goes. And that's another interesting thing. Uh, Asking for feedback from your friends and colleagues on this thing. Um, that I think will bring you a lot closer to the real world, where you have customers, you have people using your system.
Yeah. So that would be the advice for a student, I think. It's dive deep into one language, and then if you've done that in Java, let's say a Twitter clone, you've done that in Java, then try to do it in Python.
Yeah, and you'll see the huge difference, but still a lot of similarities in what you do. The ecosystem is very different. The programming can be different, but to some extent, probably.
And then if you have some extra time, try to do it in Haskell. That will be a.
Yeah, that's a challenge. Now Haskell has improved. To be honest, it has a lot more systems, more, yeah. The ecosystem is a lot better than it used to be 20 years ago, but it's still a challenge.
All right, so students, I think we are done with this.
Yes.
Let's move to junior programmers. So as junior programmer, you are newly hired, you have, I don't know, 1, 2 years experience, you are working in some projects in your organization. These projects tend to use a specific technology and you are kind of limited on that technology. Um, Probably people will hire you initially also based on how well you know uh, one technology.
Hmm.
So this, you need to keep this in mind as well. But and you need to deal with this environment. So is it worth looking at other languages at this point in time?
I think so, and I think a lot of uh, a lot of organizations could give you this option to switch or to learn something else. I mean, I don't know nowadays how many projects are based on, just on one language with the team. So maybe you can say, okay, so I've done, I don't know, Java, but uh, some colleagues use Python or JavaScript or I don't know, something. Um, can I learn that too? So that I think it's one of the easiest things to ask in the beginning.
Yeah, and I think one even simpler than that, you can probably sit down with somebody who writes Python if you are a Java programmer or JavaScript or Objective-C or and and just sit down with them for a couple of hours and see what they are doing and what 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 challenges they have and how it's different from what you are used to doing and so on. So I
Mm,
think one of the good things in organizations, particularly in larger organizations, is that you have this openness to be able to figure out what and learn from other people, right?
mm,
Because chances are there will be people there who know a vast number of technologies and might be well, I mean, you don't have to absolutely learn that language, but at least get familiarity with other people working in those languages. And I would add to that that at this point in time, you may even look at how people in the DevOps teams or IT ops are doing their automation and what they use and what challenges they have. And these
Yeah,
are
that
things
that
if you
was
get
my point
friendly
as well.
with people, sit down with them.
That was my point as well. Try to look at scripting languages. So look at something like Bash, for example, which is very helpful, very interesting. Or I um, I got to learn way back a bit of Perl, which is a very different language from anything else. Extremely powerful, extremely focused. It can be very weird, but it's really good for uh, file file processing and so on. So look at scripting languages. I think you don't need to learn everything, but just play a bit with it and understand how they work, and maybe try to do a few things with it.
Yeah. And I'm thinking nowadays there are also um, specific ways to automate infrastructure.
Mm.
So if you're lucky enough to work with teams that are using some of these tools, it's useful to see those languages because they are very similar with everything else. But just with a few lines of code, you can, spin up machines on AWS and install things, or install a Docker container on top of a server or things like that. And it's quite useful to know. Mm, These are superpowers you can use later on, and it doesn't take that much um, effort to understand them if you are sitting with somebody who actually knows what they are doing. Right. Um, okay, so I think that's it. You mentioned Perl. I'd like to go back to this. So if you don't know about Perl, there's one very fun thing you can do in Perl: write poetry. The Perl syntax is so flexible that you can actually write code that is poetry. So you read it like poetry and it interprets correctly and it runs. So that's kind of a fun thing about Perl.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so let's move further. Now, senior programmer, let's say 5 years experience around that. Um, of course, these are all approximate, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But 5 years experience, you've done the job for a number of years, you've worked in a few projects, you know, maybe you've seen different technologies, maybe you've picked up a second language, probably JavaScript, because you'll need it for something at some point. Um, is it worth looking at other languages, like, I don't know, Haskell or...
Yes, definitely. I think, at least from my experience, I tried doing a more thorough, deep project on with something else. Like, let's say I would have, if I have worked for 4 or 5 years deeply on backend programming, now I would look more on how to do a mobile thing. If I would have worked a lot on, I don't know, web PHP or something like that, I would look how to do backend, and so on. So I think even if we do backend and front end, it's still that typically we do more of one and less of the other. So at this moment, I would try to compensate and either have a pet project or try to move to a place to focus more on the other skill.
Mhm. I think one of the things that I noticed in my career is that I thought I understood object-oriented programming when I was a junior programmer, and then it took me a number of years to realize that I didn't understand object-oriented programming. And the way I understood object-oriented programming was by doing functional programming as well.
Mm-hmm.
And by learning more about the differences and the differences between the different paradigms between structured, functional, and object-oriented, and um, to realize that functional and object-oriented are very close actually.
Mm-hmm.
There are some differences, there are some constructs, there are some patterns that emerge from each of those paradigms, but in reality, you can actually think functional in object-oriented programming or things like that. And this was a very interesting observation because it turns out that you need this experience, right? You need first to go through the experience of using object-oriented programming or functional for a while and figure out, okay, now I understand what this is supposed to be. And then to realize and expand your horizon and realize, oh, that's actually not what's supposed to be.
And by object-oriented programming, I would never mean C++ class programming or
Yeah,
Java class programming. A class is not an object. An object is not a class. So object-oriented programming is very simple. Message and dispatch. So that was your lesson, and that's it.
yeah. And this is the thing that, it's so simple, but it takes you so long to understand because it's so it's funny that all the literature that I've read about object-oriented programming starts by saying, okay, so that's how you define a class.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you have inheritance, and that's how you have composition, and that's how you have the different relationships between classes. And rarely, very few books, only the good books talk about objects, identify objects, figure out messaging between objects, uh, where this is actually the key. So I think there were a lot of things added in time because as many programmers like the static structure more than the dynamics,
Mm-hmm.
but the dynamic structure of a program is the one that is much more interesting and that actually yields uh, good designs once you understand it. So that's um, and this was my take on this. So you need to dive deep for a while into paradigm to understand what it is, and then to forget what it is, and then to understand it again through the point of view of comparing with something else, with another paradigm.
But maybe for the next, let's say, 5+ years, I think maybe that's where you start understanding those 5+ years of experience, of professional experience. I mean, I think when it with maybe a condition of you trying to start using TDD and evolutionary design, and uh, push your designs to that moment, that place where you really start understanding why a certain structure of objects is good or it's not good, where you put your test to some pressure from these, or you put your code, your production code, to some pressure from these tests, and the code will show its weaknesses, and you will, I think, then learn what object orientation is. And it's obviously exactly the same with the functional programming.
Yeah. Uh, and this is, yeah, that's basically it. It's very interesting. And then I think the next level, since we are here, the level where I got to next after this was understanding how software evolves over time, which is even more meta than, or it's, let's say it's another type of dynamic, because today, so at some point you can understand that you have these objects that are structured and they give you the right solution for today. But then the interesting thing is when you realize that these objects are also submitted to pressures from outside, from clients, from inside, from developers, from paradigms, from what they know, and so on, and how they evolve over time, and how these structures evolve over time. And this is something that's very hard to reproduce in a short time period, right? You need that time to sit with a project and see how it evolves, um, to to understand that there are these forces and they can influence and so on. And this is, yeah, it's not related at all with one programming language or multiple programming languages. But if you don't understand the different paradigms and then the specific how these different paradigms work, and then it's very hard to understand the evolution otherwise.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, it's important. It's very important to look at code from this point of view. From a student point of view, I think it's almost impossible to see that. You because problems are very schoolish. I don't know how to say. They're
Are
not
focused
necessarily
on one learning or on a few
yeah,
learnings.
they're not necessarily simple. They may be very complex from the point of view of the algorithms needed. But when you go into real life and you understand the level of change that happens to some parts of the code in such a short time frame, and the reasons why, because you support some business, you support uh, some some areas in your organization with that code, then things are starting to be extremely different. And the skills you need to have are, I think, not that much based on the need of understanding how to write very good algorithms, but understanding how to write very good changeable code.
Yeah. And you don't know how to write very good changeable code until you understand how code changes.
Yes, and the forces that push you to change constantly the code. That's important. And I don't know how you could learn that in school.
Yeah, I mean, you could, but it would take a number of years working on a project, a number of years, and being very clear about what changes and why, and things like that, which I guess it would be possible, but it's quite hard to to do. Um,
Yeah. The way I know how it works like that is I know some universities really bring on projects to students early on, even from the second year. So they have like partnerships and they bring real projects and they form these teams, real teams, cross-functional teams where they start working on real projects. And I think that's the only way of looking of learning this in school, or starting to learn about real life in school.
yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That would actually be useful, I think. All right, so we talked a lot about pros, but there are also some cons to learning
Yeah.
multiple programming languages. And I think the biggest one is that it does take some time and some investment, right?
Yes, definitely. The thing how I look at it is that this domain where we live, it's is constantly changing. And if we look at it, it's so much changing. Only if I look at of JavaScript for the last 15 years, it's a huge difference. If you look at C++, which we believe to be a very conservative language, it's not. It's hugely changing. If you look at C Sharp, if you look at Java, everything is changing a lot. So I don't know how you can, what you can do anything else but learn, constantly learn. Otherwise, you might be just out of this job in a while, because well, that's what we need to do in this world, to learn. The cons are, of course, that it takes time. You put some pressure on you. You take from your personal time often. You stay away from your friends and family, and you code or whatever. You are maybe not that focused on the thing that on your, let's say, first skill, first programming language, because you start getting in your head the other concepts, and for a while it starts being mixed up and you don't understand what am I doing here. So I think it's there are some cons around this. I think you need to look at it from this way, and take the time when you are a bit, you have a bit of free time, or you're not that much focused on doing something difficult, if you want to.
And I think one big challenge, which is mostly psychological, is that uh, I think even today, many students, when they go to a job, they are hired for knowing one programming language and not for how well they know software development or how well they know, how good a programmer they are. They are hired because they are a good Java programmer, or because they are needed as Java programmers, or a C++ or a C Sharp or whatever.
Mm.
And then this becomes entangled with your identity. You start seeing yourself as a Java programmer or as a C Sharp programmer. And I've never had that. I never felt that I was a C++ programmer and I couldn't look at any other programming languages, because all those other programming languages were not as good as C++. Um, but there's definitely this tendency. And what I would say is that, look, today, if you're trying to build a web application, you need some kind of backend, Java and Python, or Ruby, or Rails, or you know, PHP or C Sharp, whatever you are using. You need front end, which is JavaScript and Objective-C, and um, all these are the languages that you can use for mobile apps and for web front end. And you need already these programming languages, plus you need probably some kind of cloud, some kind of Docker, some kind of Kubernetes, um, some kind of scripts that allow you to deploy things, a database, right?
Yeah, we
Usually,
didn't even touch database programming. Yes.
yeah. So MySQL or Postgres or
Oracle,
Amazon
Microsoft,
Aurora, or
Amazon.
you know,
Yeah, so many.
Microsoft SQL Server, or and you already need all these things. Wouldn't be it be good for you to be able to touch every part of this, and not, let's say, for you personally, although I enjoy doing that, but if it is a good thing for your career, because then if there's a bug somewhere in the front end, you can fix it if your colleague is not there. And if you're doing this again and again and again, somebody will notice. Look, he's a Java programmer, but he also fixed a front end bug. Wow, cool.
Mm.
maybe he's good to be promoted, and or she is good to be promoted and become um, a technical lead or something like that. So it's good for your career to be able to solve problems, no matter what language, what programming language you are using. And different programming languages help you solve different types of problems. This is how I see them. And of course, you need to have at least one in which you dive deeply and you know the ins and outs, and so it's good for you if you are a Java programmer to know how the virtual machine works, how the garbage collector works, what to be careful when you are doing, I don't know, multi-threading, and how the scheduling works, and how the memory is organized in the virtual machine, and how you can optimize for um, a high number of transactions on your server if you are using Java. These are all good things to know. But on the other hand, sometimes there's an opportunity for you to write a simple Python script that just automates a very simple part of your infrastructure and um, helps you move faster, and then other people notice, and this might actually be helpful. So to me, that's the end. And of course, there is some investment to do, but personally, I always found very fun to see this and to try out new programming languages.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I think that was it. Thank you, Adi, for participating.
Thank you for having me. It was a really interesting discussion. I think only to close up on the cons. There are some situations where probably, and I found that in my while coaching, especially on the security side. So there are some languages where the people don't, well, they're not that much used, and or some security slash so very low languages specific to, I don't know, a type of processor or something like that. It's very difficult to learn something else because it's a very difficult language. When you're really like talking to the machine with very basic instructions.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same with things like COBOL or, yeah, specific assembler language, or, yeah,
Exactly.
obviously,
exactly.
yeah. All right. Thank you, Adi, for participating and for the chat. I hope you find this useful. This was it. Focus chat about Polyglot Programmer, pros and cons. What do you think about it? Do you have any questions, comments, any things you want to add? Any other topic that would like to discuss in one of our focus chat or in some other type of video? Thank you so much for watching. We have to pay our dues to the YouTube algorithm, so please like, share, subscribe, tell other people about this. Discuss it in your organization. Is it worth trying out other programming languages? If you're just a one language organization, who knows? Code retreats are a really cool way to try out different programming languages. So look for a code retreat that happens remotely these days or around you. But I think that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, remember to think design and work smart.